Morning, everyone. Hope you're all doing okay, and you're surviving, staying at home, the stay-at-home recommendation. I'm going to move along here, talk about peace settlements after World War II. I wanted to talk about this. This sets the stage for the Cold War, though that wasn't intended at the time. So the Cold War is the next series of videos. And proxy wars that related to the Cold War. So talk about all that and what that meant for the United States. Well, first we'll talk about peace settlements after World War II. Um, Before the war ended, February 1945, you had three leaders of the primary powers in the Allies getting together, as of course were Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Stalin of the Soviet Union, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain. A meeting in Yalta in southern Russia over what to do with Europe after the war was over. It was the writing was on the wall by this time. The war was it was going to be a German defeat. So what to do about dealing with Germany and really specifically how not to have a World War III breakout. Remember that World War One, the lessons of World War One will come back in play here. By punishing Germany, so we'll see how they reacted to dealing with Germany in the wake of World War II. So here's a picture of this Yalta conference, very famous photograph. You have Winston Churchill here. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is very ill at this point. He dies of a stroke not long after this conference. And he's succeeded in office by Harry Truman, his vice president. And then you have Joseph Stalin here, the leader of the Soviet Union. He said it's a very famous photo, lots of good books written about the Yalta conference. So the plan was to divide Germany into zones. So there'd be a United States zone, a British zone, a France zone, even though France was not invited to Yalta. There would be a small zone that France was control of, and then Soviet Union had a plot to the east, including Berlin, although Berlin itself was split into zones, Allied, and of course the Soviet side as well. So here's the map of what this looked like. You have the United States here in the south with Munich, Great Britain, France over here with Mainz, and then Berlin again. Berlin was divided. The capital of Germany was divided into four zones itself. So USSR here in the eastern section. It was supposed to be a temporary. It's supposed to be just something to sort of occupy Germany, but it would harden into East and West divide during the Cold War. I remember growing up in the 80s, you learned about East Germany, you learned about West Germany. East Germany controlled by the Soviet Union, and West Germany by, at that point, the United States, the Allies, the West. So, and you had these. We'll talk about this in the Cold War. This dichotomy of values, of the Western values of democracy and representative government, and the Soviet Union values of communism and absolute control. The dictatorship of the proletariat, what Marx called it. So it's supposed to be temporary, but hardens into a reality that lasted until 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. The Berlin Wall wasn't built until the 61. We'll talk about the Berlin Wall being built, but this was the new reality for several decades. Else at this Yalta conference, a plan for the liberalization of, or liberation of Europe, excuse me. This was something that Stalin initially agreed to, although he would eventually set up, as we'll see in the Cold War, puppet governments. Stalin was not really in favor of having free elections because the electors, the people electing, might not vote for communist rule. So he would eventually set up puppet governments on the eastern side and what we call the Soviet bloc. We'll talk about the Soviet bloc, the Iron Curtain, so to speak. So the West would advocate these things, that Stalin initially agreed to, uh, countries encouraged to hold free elections, so they would not occupy Europe. They would seek to rebuild it, including Germany, which is very interesting. So goes against the lessons of World War One, or what they did in World War One. So holding free elections, the idea of self-determination, that people can choose their own form of government, likely, hopefully, to be democratic or Republican of some kind. Republican meaning you have representatives representing you, not a pure democracy. But the Marshall Plan, not really part of this idea, but this came after the war. It was a $13 billion plan to rebuild Western Europe and Germany. So whereas in World War One, they punished Germany, the victors punished Germany in making them pay for all the war debt, they blamed the rise of the Nazis on this, as well as the Depression. So you have this terrible circumstance where they were in dire straits, and it gave rise to a totalitarian regime. Here, the idea was a little more merciful. Let's rebuild them and refashion them, and let them determine their own fate. And since then, Germany has been an ally. Well, when it was reunited, Germany has been an ally of the United States. So, for the most part, this actually worked. This, this is more of a forgiveness as opposed to punishment. And we'll see how this played out in like the Nuremberg trials. This is what we're coming to next: war criminals tribunals. The United States decided only to prosecute top officials. So you had this problem of the ideology, and it's very hard to police ideology. So they didn't denazify Germany entirely. In order to do that, you'd have to fire all the professors. You'd have to, fire all the scientists, and I mean, the whole Nazi network was embedded in the culture of the nation. You had the Nazis had risen to power, claiming supremacy over every other ideology, and so you had to sign over your life and your work to the Nazi ideology. So denazifying would be very difficult to do. So what they do instead is just punish top officials for war crimes. And usually it's not the victors who were tried of war crimes, even though there were war crimes in the Allies as well, but the victors don't prosecute themselves. They tend to prosecute the ones they defeated. So they put top Nazi officials on trial and convict them of war crimes. But there's no significant denazification of Germany. Even in Japan, the same kind of thing happens. You have the Emperor of Japan allowed to remain, although, it's really MacArthur. Excuse me, get my coffee here. Douglas MacArthur in control of the programs of rebuilding Japan, but they allowed for the government itself, although it was kind of a puppet at this point, to remain. It's a way of not destroying any semblance of tradition. So this is seen as merciful, right? Some people might claim today this didn't go far enough. You want to punish the ideology, but like I said, it's very difficult to police ideology. So this is seen as a merciful move, and it largely worked. I mean, we have Japan as an ally, Germany as an ally, so that rebuilding did work. What else does America decide to do? U.S. decide to do? This, of course, goes counter to the idea today. But largely bringing the troops home. So where the Soviets would stay put, for the most part, the American troops came back to American shores. There was still this idea that the United States should not have a standing army after a war. Standing armies are seen as a threat to democracy. This is what we call the Cincinnatus ideal. It comes from a Roman politician, Roman dictator, head of the army, and what he does, he was the inspiration for George Washington. He leaves power and retires. Retires from his post as head of the army, and becomes a farmer. Lucius Sulla did this kind of thing himself. George Washington, this was sort of the inspiration for George Washington. He retires from office, he retires from the army, and he goes and farms at Mount Vernon. So this was seen as an ideal. So you want to uphold this American tradition, or this ancient tradition, of a great leader stepping down, knowing when to step down. So the idea of not having a standing army plays into this. So why does the United States have such a major military force? This is not the ideology today. A lot of Republicans on the conservative side, conservative Republicans, they usually advocate for a large military. Trump has rebuilt up the military, and it's just the Democrats who want to kind of keep it contained. This had to do with the Cold War. The Cold War sort of forced the United States to build the army because of an arms race. So we'll talk about that with the Soviet Union. So much so that President Eisenhower, when he's elected in '52, warned us during his presidency, the military-industrial complex, a name that's usually floated in leftist circles today, the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower warned against that it's a threat to democracy. So after World War II, there's at least an initial plan to wind down the army. Our most famous holdover from World War II, the following of World War II, the result of World War II is the United Nations. They meet in New York City. I have a picture of the building here. Very famous. You got the nations of the world, the flags. So nations of the world, if their members send representatives to the United Nations, they discuss international law, trade, mostly dealing with international conflicts. Roosevelt didn't live to see this. His wife, however, did, and I mentioned this when we talked about Eleanor Roosevelt several weeks ago. She was put in charge of a committee that drafted the Declaration for Human Rights, the Charter for Human Rights. One of her signature achievements, this declaration. The idea of human rights as a universal ideal, as opposed to just a national ideal. That will bring us to the end here. That is peace settlements after World War II. Next, we'll talk about the Cold War, some very uncomfortable kinds of things dealing with the Cold War that we still live with today. So I'll see you all later. If you have questions, send me an email. See you soon.